I just have to work out something to say. Look, both my books are actually about this business of crossings. All my life I've been conscious, actually, of living in country which has a presence, and unlike many white Australians, because I grew up in Central Australia, that presence was very visible, and so were the people. So I think that's why, you know, we are very fortunate here that that need to engage, or it just was a natural part of one's life, and it wasn't really until I went south and discovered that that wasn't the norm in Australia that I began to think about what it meant. Part of my experience growing up here, though, of course, was my parents took up a pastoral property in the mid-1960s, and that ground is the more contentious in many ways because, you know, the stations, the cattle took over the water holes, all of those things. Most of you know those stories. I then left the territory for 20 years, during which time everything changed. And for instance, the cattle station that my parents had taken up had been purchased for its Warlpiri traditional owners. It was still being run as a cattle station. I spent some time in a little railway town called Fink, south of here, that had become an Aboriginal community. Everywhere I went, suddenly everything had changed. The Aboriginal people were, in a sense, in charge, and it was really interesting to come back as an adult and have to renegotiate how to enter that ground. And in many ways, I think ever since then, that's been what my work is about. That's what I think about. In the other panel, the question came up about the sense of discomfort and how you negotiate that discomfort. You were quoted, Joe, actually, as saying, you know, it's that discomfort that allows me to feel comfortable. If I'm feeling uncomfortable, I know that I'm in this place and I'm thinking about it and so on. I actually think, too much discomfort actually makes people walk away. I think you have to find a kind of level of, maybe uneasiness is a better term, or just sort of things not quite, and being unsettled, a little bit unsettled, and teasing that out. It's probably for creativity as well. It's if you are going to make work as a writer or an artist, then to be unsettled is a great place to start from. And then you might settle, you might find something. I think it's just always a work in progress. It's not like you're looking for the point of comfort. You're just looking for a point where things come together for a moment and it moves you from where you were to the next point of being unsettled. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Kim, for that. I think everybody can relate in some way to what Kim is saying, whether you're just visiting Alice Springs today or you've been here for some time or you were here before and you've come back. I think it's really pertinent. Look, I'm really embarrassed. I'm going to introduce the other writers because I'm not just going to introduce everyone one by one like this, and I'm also going to do another bit of housekeeping, which I forgot. Look, I'm sorry, I was just a bit overcome to be facilitating this panel, and I'm a bit overwhelmed by the amount of interest that there is, and I'm like, it's not a bad feeling, it's a really good feeling. I just think it's incredible that we've got this level of interest here, and it speaks a lot to everybody.
It's a new position of discomfort.
Another one, yet another one. Okay, to my far right is Bruce Pascoe. Bruce Pascoe is a Bunurong Tasmanian and Yuin man. I'm sorry, I didn't check how to say that. Based in Gypsy Point, a remote corner of Far East Gippsland in Victoria. And Bruce was kind enough to draw me a map so I could visualise where that was in the sand. He's the author of over 20 books, and his young adult novel Fogger Docs, Magabala Books 2012, won the 2013 Prime Minister's Young Adult Fiction Award. In 2016, his non-fiction book Dark Emu, Magabala Books 2014, won the Book of the Year and the Indigenous Writers Prize in the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. And Bruce's dinner, which is happening tonight and being cooked for by Kungas Can Cook, unfortunately is sold out, and it's impossible to get a ticket because I've tried. I have really put my back into it. Just teach me not to be so disorganised. Charlie Ward, who's on my left, is a writer and a historian. He's based in Darwin. He worked in the Gurindji communities of Kalkarinji and Dagaragu between 2004 and 2006, and then as a researcher with the Stolen Generations Link-Up program in Alice Springs. He's now an oral history interviewer with the National Library of Australia, and Charlie's work has appeared in journals including Griffith Review, Meanjin and A Handful of Sand is his first book, and it's an excellent book and a terrific read if that whole story is part of your, or for me anyway, it was very defining. I think I was young when the Gurindji walked off and it was a big story, and to see the unfolding of that story in the way that Charlie has presented it is really pretty terrific. And to my very close right is Felicity Castagna. Felicity Castagna is the author of the award-winning novel The Incredible Here and Now, and its stage adaptation to be premiered at the National Theatre of Parramatta in 2017. Her collection of short stories, Small Indiscretions, was named an ABR Book of the Year. She holds a PhD from Western Sydney University and has served as a National Ambassador for Literacy and as a Director at Westwards. No More Boats by Giramondo Press is her latest novel, and that was released this year. She's a terrific writer and also a terrific person to have with my Year 10s on a Friday afternoon. So thank you. That's my special connection with her now. She's handled it. I just also want to give out for all of those who are joining us perhaps by satellite that if they have a question, or if anybody has a question that they'd like to text through, if you're on the satellite, you can ring us on 0475 918 400. And again, in case I didn't enunciate it clearly, it's 0475 918 400. So we don't want to exclude questions. But that's enough talking from me because it is. And who would like to respond next? Should we go from the outside inwards?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, okay.
Well, I hear that there's a dearth of Southerners coming up here to tell you what to do, so I thought I would help out. I was with elders yesterday on a tour around the district, and it was one of those really distressing times for an Aboriginal person to listen to the civil willful destruction of Aboriginal sacred sites in the area, stuff that is completely avoidable, but is done almost to slap Aboriginal people in the face and put them in their place. So, so many things became clear that it was possible as engineers, civil operators and community people in general to avoid, say, bulldozing what is part of one of the stories that everyone here makes their living from, because tourism virtually funds the town, and yet the caterpillar dreaming and the dog are allowed to be broken, allowed to be cut in half, and then a fence put around one part of that, and in order to protect it, to civilly protect it with corrugated iron. Beautiful it was, and a mist green. That'll do the trick. But inside, someone had written in perfect text on a commercially produced sign, please don't forget to feed the pet rock. And that's the official regard for that site. It is heartbreaking to be with people for whom that story is the centre of their very life. It is very distressing. We can do something about it. And it was pointed out that people coming through the gap into the town would normally have had to wait and be asked permission to enter. And my wife said yesterday, after having heard that story, well, it's not impossible to do it again. Not that you wait outside for 3 days, not that you wait outside for 3 hours, not even stop for 3 minutes, but that you are aware that you require a welcome to come into that country. It wouldn't cost much, and every Chinese and Japanese and German, French, Italian tourist that left the town, that is what they would tell their neighbours in Vienna and Brunswick and all those places. That is what they remember. 70% of overseas tourists name interaction with Aboriginal people as one of their top 3 priorities. It's been going on for decades and decades, and yet in Australia we don't do it very well. Alice Springs does it better than anywhere else I've seen, perhaps, but still there is more to do. 0.03% of people name getting eaten by a crocodile as one of their preferred activities here. Very few of them get their wish. 0.01% say they want to become members of the Richmond Football Club. Their visa is never stamped because it's clearly they're disoriented and need more help than a visit to Alice Springs can do for them. But there's so much we can do as a community, and I know I'm preaching to the converted, but we all have a responsibility. There's all something we can do. We've all got neighbours. We all buy our bread and fuel our cars from places where these opinions may appear strange. But we can do something about it. And Kim and I were in Queenscliff, place in Victoria, don't worry about it too much, last weekend, having a glass of wine or two. I hope we can repeat it tonight. And we were talking about the will and the need and the craving that all Australians have to identify with their land. You know, this is a beautiful country. If you're born here, if you come here, you spend more time here than a holiday, then it becomes part of your soul. And everyone should be allowed for it to become part of their soul, because the body needs it, the mind needs it, the soul needs it. We can't disallow that, because the 2 facts of Australian history: black people aren't going to go away, white people aren't going to go away. It's what we do with those 2 facts that make the difference. And so we all have to have an attachment to our country. Aboriginal people don't want loose and willful spirits wandering around their country. We want you to belong, but in order to belong, you have to know the story, the history of the country, and to keep on defying it, to keep on rendering Australian history as "don't forget to feed the pet rock," means that you haven't really assimilated. And I think it would be good if all non-Aboriginal Australians assimilated.
Yeah. Thank you. Felicity?
I'm really interested in the telling of local stories, which is why, you know, I'm so honoured to be in Alice Springs and to have done so many workshops in schools. In this last week, I've gotten to hear so many different types of local stories from all sectors of the community. To me, the only stories worth telling are those small stories of local spaces that shape our lives. And to me, if we're really going to get at the story of what it means to be a nation, we all need to be telling these small, intimate stories of these places that are important to us, of those places that shape our histories and that shape who we perceive of ourselves as human beings, which, you know, I think Bruce and Kim were just talking about. I come from Parramatta. It's in the western suburbs of Sydney. I live at the kind of mouth of the Parramatta River. It's a story to me that is fundamentally connected to our history and our relationship with boats, which is what my latest novel, No More Boats, is about. In that space, it's often referred to in early colonial journals as the place where the boats can go no further, because it's a place where early colonialists in the late 1700s came to find farmable land and stopped because they couldn't get further inland to New South Wales. It's also the place where Pemulwuy fought those boats back with other Indigenous people in the area. It's also the place where post-World War II migrant families like my own came to work in the factories in nearby Silverwater and Granville. It's also a place now which is associated with a different kind of boat people, which is our most recent arrivals, and in particular the refugee population, which are now in that space. So what I've tried to do with my writing is to really consider the way that all of those stories are inscribed on those local space, and the way that if we kind of peel them back and uncover them, we can maybe get at the story of what it means to be both in that space in Parramatta, but also how that space in Parramatta is also one of our spaces of national story that is not just important to me, but is important in weaving together all the different stories of this place, so we can kind of find out who we are in the past and now, and how that past might inform who we are now. I don't know what else to say.
Thank you. That's a lot. That's good. Yeah, I think, just as an aside to that, when I read your bio and it said the National Theatre of Parramatta, I thought, we've come a long way.
That's really cheeky.
But it is, that's a cultural shift.
Yeah.
That is a big cultural shift in a city that has always favoured its eastern seaboard, you know?
Yeah. To like explain that just briefly, what the joke is there, because it is kind of a joke, is the fact that the western suburbs of Sydney, not just in our national landscape, but particularly in the New South Wales Sydney landscape, has always been this kind of place on the edge that nobody sees as being particularly important. There's been a lot of uproars about arts festivals moving there recently because no one wants to go and see arts in Western Sydney. No artists live there apparently. And they just got a federal funding grant to set up a theatre which they very appropriately called the National Theatre of Parramatta. And I love it, and I'm so incredibly proud to have been able to adapt my last book for stage there.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Charlie.
It's good to hear what everyone else's thoughts are on this. The book that I've written is A Handful of Sand. It's about Gurindji country, and perhaps even in the photo on the front we can see a meeting here and a crossing. And the theme of this festival was quite appropriate for me to speak about in regards to this, because the book and the history of Wave Hill is founded on a crossing. It's literally the principle or the physical object that locates the history of interaction that has happened on Gurindji country. Of course, that took me about 10 years to kind of realise that. I came up here in 2001 with a sort of hazy notion of wanting to understand more about the country that I was part of, and thinking it might have something to do with learning more about Aboriginal people, and also wanting to escape the winters of the Blue Mountains, which I'd had enough of. It was 2004 when I was drawn to Wave Hill with the offer of employment. And Gurindji land is sort of an in-between place. It's in between the desert, it's in between the desert and the saltwater country. It's a place where there's been a lot of movement historically. And I've tried to allude to that, to draw attention to that in the opening sentence of the introduction of the book, which I'm just going to read 2 sentences. Ochre-drawn serpents, bats and emus watched the first white man traverse Gurindji land in 1879. Nat Buchanan, or Paraway, the overlander, guided his horse across black soil plains between craggy red hills and spring-fed creeks. To the keen eyes of this country's residents, the four-legged apparition appeared as a devil spirit. So I hope in that there's a sense of the recognition of the importance of the country and the people to which it belongs, as well as the kind of awkward presence of the emissary of the state, the settler society, and we wonder how that presence can be resolved. And it makes me think of what Bruce has just said about permissions and things. We don't know how that communication unfolded with Bluey Buchanan, but at that point what was happening was that the pastoral industry was spreading westward and traversing Gurindji land, and it was actually a river crossing there on the Victoria River that caused them to go that particular direction. And that crossing is now where the Victoria Highway is, and what became the Wave Hill Welfare Settlement, Drovers Common, etc., etc., now the community known as Kalkaringi. So I ended up there in 2004, and ironically, Wave Hill, Gurindji people, Kalkaringi are all quite well known for the history in comparative terms, like more than many other Aboriginal communities. There's this great iconography and celebration of land rights and the Wave Hill Walk-Off and the amazing leadership that those people displayed in those years. And I was living there, and to me there was sort of something incongruous going on, because I was actually being employed by the community council at the time, and the context of that was to organise a strategic plan, and I guess the sort of subtext was that many people weren't particularly sort of engaged with the community or feeling like they had a sense of ownership or direction with it. And so it was an incongruous position to be in, sort of reconciling the amazing leadership of land rights and then wondering what the steps in between were that had kind of created a situation like in many of the places in the bush in the north and centre today. So that's was my kind of calling card, I suppose, to start investigating and learning what I could about the history of those places. And overwhelmingly, that story has been one of interaction, of inspiration, of cross-fertilisation, of fusion, of people meeting each other with very different kind of worldviews and ideas of what the sort of nature of the communication is. That's the job in front of them, and it's certainly been something that's changed me and many others. And I think most of the non-Indigenous people that I've met, it's probably 100 or something that I've interviewed, just about all of them would speak about the great inspiration that they felt. It was sort of a highlight of their life, the richness of being in that country and knowing Gurindji people. And I suppose the question is, of what benefit to the local mob, and hopefully conversations like this can unfold that a bit more.
Thank you, Charlie. I do have a question if nobody else has a question, but I think it's best if somebody else asks one. Would you like to ask a question? You need the mic. Can you use the mic for the satellite?
Thanks.
talent to be exactly where I shouldn't be at any particular moment. So we're getting text messages coming in from the 6 locations where this event's being streamed. So this particular question is from Nooka. And they've actually sent through a photo, and there's about 20 or 30 odd people in the Arts Centre there, which is really lovely to see. So they're... Yay! Okay, so the question from Nooka Arts Centre is for Bruce. In researching dark emu, what did you discover about the dietary habits of people before colonisation, I guess, came along the Roper River? So during the research, what did you discover about the dietary habits of those people?
Well, people around Australia were very well. The English people who came into the country remarked on the overall health of the people, the state of their teeth, which was perfect, which was strange for an Englishman. If you remember Spike Milligan's brown, green and black. And the people were choosing foods which were perfect for their diet. We're grinding kangaroo grass into flour at the moment, and it's difficult. It's not an easy grain to handle. And people keep on saying to me, Aboriginal people wouldn't have done that. Well, we know they did do that, and the reason they did it was because the flour is so nutritious, and it has an interaction with the rest of the body through the gut that is completely positive. And it is a very important, it's going to be a very important food as it was then. I'm not absolutely certain about what the people on Roper River did, but those grains will still be there, those foods will still be there, and it's our job as Aboriginal people to help find those things again. I know there's been an incredible amount of work done in many communities of commercialising some of those foods, but it's not... Australia seems to want bush tucker. They seem to want the occasional fruit, the occasional spice, but I'm interested in the staples, the flowers and the tubers, because that talks about occupation of the land and persistent agricultural interaction with the land. And I'm interested in that as an Aboriginal person, because it gets rid of the myth that Aboriginal people were helplessly wandering around the face of the globe until they found a berry and stuck it in their mouth. And so could so easily be moved off the land by Europeans who had ploughs and really important things like that. Our people utilised the land because the land was our mother. So not only did we utilise it and grow food on it systematically and agriculture, we also treated the land as if it was our mother. And soil degradation in this country is appalling. We've lost metres of soil, topsoil, from the land by trying to treat it as if it was Kent. You can plough Kent. They do it every day over there because the soils are moist and they're heavy. Over here, our soils are light, they're fine, and we have to look after them. It is our mother. And that's a long answer to a very short question, but I appreciate the mob from Roper River asking the question. I hope you're having a good time there, and I hope that in the future you'll be able to take economic benefit from selling your foods to Australians, because those foods must have been nutritious because of the great health of your people.
Thanks. I thought I'd just sort of put to the other panellists this sort of idea about one of the things Felicity talked about yesterday was to the kids at school, where she talked about stories just being about particular moments in time. And I think all of the panellists, in some ways, work with this idea because Charlie's re-looking at time and he's looking at the different stories that have existed and another story that can exist now. Kim's book is Position Doubtful was very well named for me because I was lost a lot in Position Doubtful, just because of the sheer volume of or intersects of time in the book, and how much I had to intellectually stay. I felt it was like reading a Russian novel, quite frankly, but you didn't give me a, what do you call it, a genealogy to help me out, you know? I had to really, it wasn't a book that you could read when you're feeling a little tired. I had to be very mindful of the time, the shifts, and that beautiful idea of not just of time and experiences changing, but points of view and those mapping experiences. And I think with Felicity, when Felicity is writing about, and I shouldn't have been cheeky about Parramatta, but
Oh, everybody is.
everybody is. I was just feeling pretty Sydney-ish, I think. But the thing is that Parramatta has been, the story of Parramatta has been told in many, many different ways over time. And one of the things that I wonder about, and coming back to what the point Bruce said about how we all must, the aim is that we all get on, is like, I'm not quite sure why these different stories, these different times, we can't start to have some sort of respect between all those moments. Perhaps I'm saying this really, really badly, but I'm just wondering about this idea. All these stories are really rich, but all these negative stories are still prevail. Why is that? When these cultural experiences are so rich, why is it there's such a negative image around? Well, I'm right off track now.
It's easy. Like, I always think it's very easy to tell a story that's not complex, right? Like, so it's very easy to paint a character as good or bad. It's very easy to paint a place as good or bad. Any writer can do that. Like, any person in the media telling a story about that place can do that. Like, what I think better writers do is paint a place as complex rather than negative or positive.
Yeah, I'd definitely support that. I think with land rights, this photo, the Great Handover and the referendum in 1967 are both great examples of complicated events that over time have become sort of glossed into a simple narrative that we can all kind of get behind and orient ourselves towards. With what I've been doing, it wasn't my intention to sort of, I didn't have an assumption about where things were going to go or what this type of story was that I wanted to tell. I just wanted to fill in the dots, and it has become a broader story and something more complex. Possibly some people would say it's a revisionist take on the land rights story, but I think it's all there for the telling. It's all grist to the mill, that the way things have panned out, around those kind of iconic moments.
I haven't ever been compared to a Russian novelist before, so I'm not quite sure whether that's positive or negative.
Oh, it's very positive. It's positive.
And I guess one of the reasons I write is that, I mean, I don't feel negative about these stories. And I think one of the reasons that the book has the sort of layering or complexity that Joe talked about is that I sort of wrote it the way one would make a map, because I think that the country holds the stories from, everything that has happened in a place is still somehow present in that place, and that by taking place as your starting point, then, the stories layer and intersect and come through. The notion of the palimpsest, which is actually one of the metaphors I use in one of my chapters, is that even though a palimpsest is actually a document that is erased and reused, but, constantly what is left underneath is not properly erased, or you get a sort of, intaglio that imprints itself on what is written over the top, so that, layer upon layer upon layer is still somehow present. And if you learn how to look, you can potentially, enter any one of those layers, or maybe, you know, all of them simultaneously. So, in fact, going back to, I was on the same tour yesterday that Bruce spoke about. I've never done a tour of Alice Springs, a guided tour on a bus. It was really interesting to, you know, sit there and be driven around and taken to places, some of which I used to ride my pony over in the 1960s. And while on the one hand, yes, there was this sense of willful sort of, you know, destruction or resistance to this underlying story, it was still there. And what really struck me was how many other large towns in Australia has that level of presence weaving through the town, even if it is just a little hummock in somebody's backyard. But everybody knows about it, that there is this astonishing kind of intermeshing of, you know, this very ancient story through the sort of suburbs and backyards and so on. And my sort of particular passion in terms of how we do bring these stories together is through mapping, because you can put them all together on a map. And in fact, I keep harping back to the earlier session, but I'm sure I saw an aerial image of the town on screen, and you could actually see the caterpillars cutting through the town. And I thought, what a fabulous, unless, you know, someone may already be doing it here, but what a fabulous project for school students to map their town, all the stories of their town, including those pathways through it. And I think, you know, if there's going to be a way to bring the different stratas of the community together, when you can all be in the place, when everybody's story, instead of feeling guilty that your white story has overridden this original Indigenous story, if you can find the place where they all are on the map together, they're told together, I think, you know, these are the ways in which we can actually start appreciating just how complex and rich and wonderful the you know, the potential for our place and how to connect to it actually is. And one more point I'll make before I shut up. One of the reasons I wanted to ask Veronica whether she felt there was anything that she got from the other side, whether she learned anything from the white side of the conversation, because I've worked quite a lot with Aboriginal people, and there's invariably several people that put themselves forward to work with white fellas. They're you know, they're really precious people to work with, and it's because they are actually intrigued by us as well. You know, there's something going on that, you know, there's a desire to sort of get a sense of you know, why we're in this place and what we think. And so, you know, I think it's important to remember that it potentially can work both ways. So, yeah, that's my position. Doubtful.
Not very doubtful at all, I don't think. Now, do we want to take a question from the audience now? Did you want to? Just don't stand on the speaker. I'll try and lean forward.
So I'm not very good at phrasing questions, so this is the way I'm going to say it. I was just wondering if the panel, everyone on the panel has a comment on not just, like, you know, how stories exist in time, but how stories and information change over time. Because as I'm listening to all of your words as you're talking, I remember, like, a couple of weeks ago, I read this news article on SBS talking about blackbirding, which was basically the Australian slave trade. And I learned about that originally in grade 10, but in grade 10 in 2007, 10 years ago, my year 10 history teacher told me that there was no slave trade in Australia. And so it's basically the same story, it's about the same thing, but the information they're giving us about it has changed. So I was just wondering if anyone has a comment about that.
Anyone putting their hand up to answer that one?
Well, it's wrong.
Right. Thank you.
You know, there was slave trade. You know, it's just part of Australian history, and a lot of it is wrong, and we need to rewrite it. And you know, my teachers told me that too, and they're a lot older than yours, but they weren't mean people. It was the history they'd been taught too. So we have to put in a massive amount of work into retelling the story. And when non-Aboriginal people enter that area, sometimes it's problematic in the press. People want black people to write about black subjects and white people to write about white subjects. But when the two subjects merge, it's people get all precious about it, particularly the Melbourne Age. And Leah Hills is in the audience. Her book is for sale over there. And it's a book which tells about a journey from the south to here, which Leah has just replicated with her family to get here for the Writers' Festival. And this is a book which talks about both sides of the Australian coin. And, you know, I hear that some white reviewers aren't happy that she should be writing that. I think she has every right to write it. But the writer who's going to enter that area must know Aboriginal people, must know the Aboriginal history and story. And your teacher was teaching you out of a subject that he or she didn't know very well. We have to reform ourselves, and we're not going to do it by silencing white writers. We're not going to do it by silencing black writers, which we've been trying to do for 200 years. You know, you have a writers' festival, an Indigenous writers' festival. 20 years ago, you get Jack Davis, you know, 4 or 5 other people, Udguru when she was alive. Now, you get 70 writers. Ellen Van Nieven's about 16. She might be 22. I don't know. But, you know, like, these are children. And they're writing...
Give us a break.
It's all relative. They're writing beautifully. So things have changed. But, you know, these people are writers. They're neither black nor white. And they're Australian writers. But the Australian responsibility is to know the full history of the country. And that history is at least 80,000 years old. Probably 100,000. But 80,000 is now official because a midden in Warrnambool was aged at just that age last year. 80,000 years. 10,000 years before out of Africa. Study that at school and work out how people could get from Africa to here in minus 10,000 years. Doesn't stand up to maths or science or morality.
Thank you for that, Bruce.
I had a quick response as well. Yeah, I think that we are getting better at telling complex stories too in this country, and that's probably been happening over several decades. And I think it's to be celebrated because there's a great tendency to simplify things, and I think the more simplified our stories are, the sort of the greater traction they have, and the more they spread, and the more potential for disinformation and damaging kind of outcomes can be. And, you know, we see that in politics. I think Tony Abbott was a master of the simple kind of message. Yeah, so let's keep looking at all the points of view and all the perspectives that we can to enrich the stories that we have about our land and recognise its richness now and in the past.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to add, or should we take another question?
I was just going to briefly add that I think the more that we complexify our stories, the more that they make us uncomfortable, and sometimes that's why we don't do that. And I think that that's very present in the moment in a lot of Australian stories.
Thank you. Kim, did you want to respond?
Look, I guess it's really, you have to look at who wrote that history, and you know, they're going to present their point of view, and so the more I'm just reiterating what other people have said, the more different positions of people's stories you get, then the more complex the history gets. But if you are wondering whether something is true or not, I think the first thing, or whether something is really legitimate, the first thing is to ask who actually wrote that history and take it from there.
Thank you. Now we're going... Sorry, I don't want to stop you applauding. We're going to kind of move it along now. It's going to be a bit like sort of speed interviewing, speed questions, because we've only got 8 minutes and I was told to keep this to time, which I'm really reluctant to do, but Danny's just sitting there. So I've got another question here.
Thank you. Thanks for all your words and for your thoughts. Just thinking about books, they're of course important windows, in fact portals into other worlds. They really can open up your imagination and let you experience something vicariously and just get really get a visceral sense of what you're writing about. The nature of your work and your topic, through both your writing and what you've been talking about in today's forum, is of course place and space and land and country, and those things are really things that need to be immersed to be understood. So how far do you think that books can go, and what do you as writers hope to impart to your readers?
Big questions, small answers, please.
I would just say that it doesn't matter whether it's a book or that magnificent sand painting we saw here last night. It's just a story. We sometimes get a bit ahead of ourselves. We're talking about the sophistication of art. All art is just a story, and it is no different to the caterpillar story, the Russian novel. They just didn't write a lot about caterpillars.
I always like Sean Tan's advice on writing. The Australian author and illustrator Sean Tan, he says the purpose of writing is not to provide any answers, but to work out what the best question is to ask your audience. And I think that that's also what stories are about. It's just about because you can never put everything into a story. So the best thing that you can do with a story is to open up a lot of possibilities for questions that the reader can walk away and ask themselves. What is my connection with my landscape? What did that character teach me about how I want to be as a human being?
Thank you.
I think that's a really interesting question, especially when you're talking about working with oral cultures. And I think that the contribution that a book or a big writing project like my one can make in that context is pretty limited. I don't think that there's going to be a lot of people sitting around at Dagaragu in the next couple of months ploughing through 300 pages of prose. I think that in that situation, I think it becomes more about the relationship and perhaps other contributions and the exchange that you can contribute through other means. And I think that I've probably done more from the perspective of most Gurindji people. They're probably more appreciative of the photographs that I've been able to return to the community, which are more popular than anything, And yeah, I go there and work on events and festivals and things, and that's probably a different form of consolidating a relationship, which perhaps has more value than the book.
I actually, just to pick up on what Charlie's been saying, I think for Aboriginal people, for Indigenous people that I work with, many of whom the older people aren't literate, books are actually becoming more and more important. People are very conscious that knowledge is being lost, and although there's been a great deal of audio recording and video and so on, it's amazing how that stuff disappears. It's sort of, it was done on tape years ago, a lot of it, and nobody's got around to digitising it, and it's ended up in a sort of, back drawer in a culture centre somewhere. the book continues to be this object that gets passed around and poured over and sat with. And I facilitated a couple of years ago with Terry Ann White, who's actually in the audience and who's going to be doing some panels here. It was a project of writing from sort of from the desert, essentially. And I facilitated some of the sort of Indigenous school kids and old people, and we decided that writing was, if somebody transcribed someone's story, then that counted as writing. And this book has got this cross-section of some of the little kids telling stories of events through to, you know, transcribed oral stories. To see the traction that book has got now back in the community is amazing. The kids are using it, it's being used in the school, they're reading what they wrote and said 3 or 4 years ago and saying, I spelt that wrong, or I said that wrong, or my grammar was wrong. It's being used as a... And I see it as that sort of shifting from literacy to literature, that this process is actually a really significant one today, where I think books still have enormous traction. They're by no means the only way of communicating, but they're still really, really important. And book as object too.
Thank you. One more? Okay, I think we've got one more question down the back. Sorry.
Thank you. This is more a comment, I think. You touched on in your book, Kim, about the loss of people, loss of old people, old knowledge. And I think it's, there's something came out this week, I think, Bruce, about Tasmania. There's some bloke did a new book out about someone who went around and recorded everything he could in the 1890s when they're supposed to be all deceased. I think there's a real problem with my information. I suppose I've travelled a fair bit. That most of the old men I went with, they're all deceased. There's only 1 or 2 alive now. A great deal of where I went, no one else is going to go to very readily. And I think I've got a problem with the information I've got. How should we ever be hand-on? That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Dick.
Thank you. I think we've come to the end of our session. Okay, yeah, no, Danny's making really terrible signs at me. Look, so what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to thank the authors for their time and for their intellect and then, now when you leave, you go and thank them properly by buying their books, and then you find them and you get them to sign them, because it's a rare opportunity to have your book signed. And I think to remember that all of us are part of the journey, all of us are part of the crossing, and we need to all take, whether we're writers or readers, we need to take some individual responsibility to make sure that the stories that are making it to the page, that are part of this whole history, are the ones that need to be there. Okay? And like Bruce said, not just to talk to those people at the petrol station, to confront things when you need to. Not angrily, but well, thoughtfully. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.